My name is Dana Marsh. I'm 37. And 4 months ago, I stood at gate C14 at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, watching my boarding pass fail to scan for the third time, while a gate agent named Priya told me, apologetically, that my ticket had been canceled less than an hour earlier, and that the flight, my parents' 40th anniversary trip to Cabo San Lucas, a trip I had planned for 8 months and paid for in full, was now boarding. Without me. My phone buzzed while I was still standing at the counter. A text from my mother. Have fun walking home, loser. A second text, 30 seconds later, from my father. Take the bus. Know your place. I did not text back. I did not raise my voice at the gate agent, who had done nothing wrong and clearly felt terrible about the situation she'd inherited. I put my phone back in my pocket, asked Priya for 1 minute, and made a single phone call. 10 minutes later, she looked past me, down the jet bridge, toward my parents, who were already seated in 2A and 2B, and said into her radio, "There's been a change." Before I tell you what that call actually was, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this story is landing somewhere real. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from, now. Let me take you back. I need to tell you about my family before I tell you about the gate, because what happened at C14 did not come out of nowhere. It came out of 37 years of a very specific role I had been assigned in my family, quietly, without ever being asked whether I wanted it, and had spent most of my adult life performing without fully naming it, even to myself. I am the older of 2 daughters. My sister Brooke is 34. Growing up, Brooke was, in the particular language my parents used without ever quite saying it directly, the daughter things came easily too. She was effortlessly social, effortlessly charming, the kind of person adults liked instantly, and other kids wanted to be near. Teachers wrote things on her report cards like a joy to have in class, and meant it. And my parents would read those comments aloud at dinner with a kind of soft, easy pride that never seemed to require any additional effort on Brooke's part to earn. I was the other kind of daughter, the capable kind, the one who got good grades without much fuss, who could be handed a problem and trusted to solve it without supervision, who my parents learned, early and permanently, they could rely on. My report cards said things like conscientious and organized, and a pleasure to work with, which are, if you sit with them long enough, compliments about function rather than about a person, the kind of language you might use to describe a well-built appliance. I don't say any of this with self-pity. I say it because I think it's the actual architecture the rest of this story was built of, and I didn't fully see its shape until I was standing at that gate at 11 o'clock at night. I want to give you a few specific memories, because I think the abstraction of it, the daughter who handles things, doesn't quite land the way the individual moments do. When I was 12, our family dog, a beagle named Scout, got sick in a way that eventually turned out to be serious. And it was me, not my parents, who noticed the specific pattern of symptoms over several days and pushed for a vet visit that ended up catching the illness early enough to treat. My parents were genuinely grateful and impressed, and told the story for years afterward at family gatherings. Dana caught it. Can you believe she was only 12? Delivered with real warmth. I remember loving that story, loving being the 12-year-old who caught it for a long time. It took me until my 30s to notice that the story was never really about me being loved. It was about me being useful, at 12, in a way that impressed the adults around me, and that those are 2 different things that had simply gotten permanently tangled together in how my family talked about who I was. When I was 16, my parents went through a stretch of real financial strain, the kind that showed up in small ways around the house, tenser conversations after the mail arrived, fewer restaurant dinners, a specific quality of quiet that settled over the kitchen some evenings. I remember, at 16, quietly teaching myself the basics of a household budget from a library book, and eventually sitting down with my mother, uninvited, with a spreadsheet I'd built by hand, showing her where some monthly expenses could be trimmed. My mother cried that evening and told me I was the most responsible person she had ever met, even then, at 16 years old. I remember feeling, in that moment, an enormous swell of pride. The specific pride of a child who has just been told, in the clearest terms available, that she matters to her family's survival. I did not think, at 16, or for a long time afterward, to ask myself whether a 16-year-old should have needed to build that spreadsheet at all, or whether being told you are the most responsible person your mother has ever met is actually the kind of thing a parent should be saying to their child. By the time I was in college, I had become, without any formal announcement, the family's default logistics person. If a flight needed booking, I booked it. If a hotel reservation got confused, I called and fixed it. When my grandmother's estate needed sorting after she passed, when I was 26, it was me, not my father, her own son, who ended up on the phone with the funeral home and the county clerk's office, spending the better part of 3 weeks navigating probate paperwork my father, by his own admission, found completely overwhelming. Because, as my mother put it at the time, you're just so much better at this kind of thing than the rest of us, sweetheart. I took that as a compliment for years. I have come, more recently, to understand it as something closer to an assignment, one I never actually agreed to, that simply hardened into an expectation the longer I performed it well. I want to tell you about one more memory from that period, because I think it's the clearest early example of the pattern that would eventually explode at Gate C-14. My grandmother's funeral, which I had organized almost entirely on my own, from the flowers to the reception venue to the specific hymn my grandmother had once mentioned, in passing years earlier, that she wanted played, fell on the same weekend as a work conference I had been building toward for over a year. One that included a presentation I had spent months preparing in front of the entire regional leadership team of the firm I worked for at the time. I canceled the conference without much internal debate, because that is simply what a person in my role in my family did when the family needed something handled. And nobody, not my mother, not my father, not Brooke, ever once asked me what it had cost me to cancel it. Because nobody in my family, at that point, had any real framework for imagining that being the capable one might cost me something. 2. I built a career, eventually, that made this role even more entrenched, in a way I think about now with a certain wry irony. I work in travel operations for a corporate services firm, managing complex, high-stakes itineraries for executives, coordinating multi-country trips with a level of precision that leaves almost no room for error, which meant that by my early 30s, I had accumulated a significant amount of airline status, a deep, practical fluency in how reservation systems actually work behind the scenes, and a network of industry contacts that most ordinary travelers never have reason to develop. My family knew this, vaguely, the way people know facts about each other without really absorbing their implications. What they mostly understood, in practice, was that when Dana handles the travel, things go smoothly. And Dana handles the travel because Dana is good at it and doesn't seem to mind. I want to describe a specific incident from my career, actually, because I think it foreshadows what happened at the gate more than I realized at the time. About 4 years ago, a senior executive at my firm had his entire family's reservation, an 8-person, 3-country itinerary I had personally built, thrown into chaos when his adult son attempted to make an unauthorized change to a shared booking, believing, incorrectly, that being listed as a companion traveler gave him the authority to modify the reservation on his own. I remember walking that executive through the same explanation Marguerite would eventually give me, that only the account holder has that authority, that a companion is not the same as a co-owner. And I remember thinking, at the time, purely as an interesting professional footnote, how often people misunderstand who actually controls a shared reservation until the moment it matters. I did not think, 4 years ago, explaining this to a stranger over the phone, that I would eventually need that same knowledge to protect myself from my own mother. I want to be honest that I did not, for a long time, mind occupying this role. I liked being useful. I liked being the person my family could count on. There is a real, genuine satisfaction in being good at something, in being the one people turn to. And I do not want this story to sound like a complaint about competence itself, because competence has given me a great deal in my life, including the career I actually love. What I want to describe, instead, is the much slower, harder thing to notice, which is the difference between being valued for what you do and being valued for who you are, a difference that can stay completely invisible for years, decades even, right up until the moment someone in your life treats the two as fully interchangeable, and you're left standing somewhere, suddenly seeing the gap between them for the first time with total clarity. My parents' 40th wedding anniversary was coming up, and I decided months in advance that I wanted to give them something significant. I want to describe the specific feeling I had deciding on this gift, because I think it matters to understanding how deeply this whole situation eventually cut. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening, scrolling through resort options, feeling something I don't think I'd felt in quite this particular way before. A kind of eager, hopeful excitement, not about executing a task well, which was familiar territory, but about giving something. I wanted, for once, for my family to experience me not as the person who fixes the trip, but as the daughter who gave them the trip, a distinction that felt, at the time, meaningful enough to plan around for the better part of a year. I proposed a full week in Cabo San Lucas, a nice resort right on the water, flights for the four of us, myself, Brooke, and both of my parents, all of it as my gift, funded entirely by me. I want to be specific about the financial structure here because it matters enormously to everything that follows. I booked all 4 flights under my own frequent flyer account, using a combination of miles and a significant amount of my own money, which meant that on the airline system, I was listed as the primary account holder and booking contact for the entire reservation, with my parents and Brooke listed as companions traveling on an itinerary I owned and controlled. I also booked the resort under my name and my credit card for the same reason, and arranged the airport transfers and built out a full day-by-day itinerary, snorkeling on day 2, a sunset dinner cruise for the actual anniversary date, a spa afternoon for my mother that I knew, from small comments over the years, she had always wanted and never quite let herself book for herself, which I shared with everyone weeks in advance, genuinely excited. In a way I don't think I fully admitted to myself at the time, to finally be the one giving my parents something large and meaningful, rather than simply fixing whatever needed fixing. I remember calling my mother the evening I finalized the booking, reading her the full itinerary over the phone, and she said, "Dana, this is too much. You didn't have to do all this," in a tone that I heard, at the time, as gratitude, and that I have thought about many times since, wondering whether some smaller, quieter part of what she said was actually discomfort, the specific discomfort of watching. The daughter she had always positioned as the useful one step, for once, into a role that felt less like usefulness and more like generosity, a role she perhaps was not entirely prepared to receive from me. About 6 weeks before the trip, my mother called to tell me that her longtime friend Denise, a woman I've known my whole life but am not especially close to, had recently gone through a difficult divorce, and that my parents wanted to invite Denise along on the trip to cheer her up. I want to describe that call in more detail than I have before, because I think the specific texture of it matters. My mother's tone, as she raised the idea, was careful, almost rehearsed, the tone of someone who has practiced how she is going to bring something up. She said, "Denise has had such a hard year, and I keep thinking how nice it would be for her to get away, and I wondered if there might be a way to include her. I said, honestly, that I understood the impulse, but that the trip was specifically planned and paid for as an anniversary gift for the two of them, with Brooke and me along as their daughters, and that adding a fifth person would change both the cost and the intimacy of what I had intended to give them. I explained, patiently, that the resort room was booked for exactly 4, that the flight cabin configuration I'd secured with my status upgrades accommodated exactly 4, and that adding a fifth traveler on short notice, 6 weeks out, would require either an entirely separate booking at Denise's own expense or a significant and costly restructuring of everything I had already arranged. My mother said she understood, and the conversation ended there, warmly enough, with her thanking me again for everything I'd put together, or so I believed, walking away from that call with no sense at all that anything had actually been left unresolved. I did not find out until I was standing at the gate, 4 months later, that my mother had, in fact, decided to invite Denise anyway, and that because the resort room and the flight cabin configuration made adding a full fifth traveler complicated on short notice, she had made a decision, without consulting me at all, that Denise would take my seat and that I would simply not be going. I want to describe the weeks between that phone call and the actual trip, because in hindsight, there were signals I missed, small enough at the time that I didn't think twice about any of them individually, but that, looking back now, form a fairly clear pattern. My mother mentioned Denise, in passing, in 2 or 3 subsequent phone calls, in a way that struck me, faintly, as odd, given that I believed the question of her joining had already been settled. Once, she said something like, "Denise is so excited about everything you've planned," a sentence I let pass without much thought, assuming it referred to some general vicarious excitement about hearing about the trip secondhand, rather than what it actually was, which was Denise's excitement about a seat my mother had already, quietly, decided she would be occupying. Brooke called me about 10 days before the trip, and there was a moment in that call, brief, that I have replayed many times since. She asked me, somewhat carefully, whether the room in Cabo had 4 beds or some other configuration, a question that struck me as slightly strange at the time, since I had shared the exact room layout with everyone weeks earlier, but that I attributed, without much scrutiny, to Brooke simply not having read the details closely, which was, admittedly, in character for her. I answered the question directly, and the conversation moved on to something else. I understand now, having talked to Brooke about it since, that she was already carrying the knowledge of what my mother intended to do. And that question was the closest she came, in that entire 10-day window, to giving me any kind of warning. I want to walk you through exactly how I found this out on the actual day, because the sequence matters. I arrived at the airport that Friday evening, on time, in good spirits, wearing the specific traveling outfit I'd picked out that morning, with a kind of anticipatory pleasure I don't think I'd felt about a family trip in years. Checked my bag, made it through security without incident, and was sitting at the gate with Brooke, who I later learned had been told about the Denise situation only 2 days earlier and had been asked directly by my mother not to mention it to me until we were already at the airport, because, in my mother's words to Brooke, it would be easier if Dana didn't have time to make a whole thing out of it beforehand. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, because I think about it often. Make a whole thing out of it. My mother's operating assumption, going into this, was that my reasonable objection to being uninvited from a trip I had planned and paid for would constitute me making a scene, rather than my having a legitimate response to something that had been done to me without my knowledge or consent. I think that phrase, more than almost anything else in this entire story, captures the exact shape of the role I had been assigned. A person whose objections are pre-categorized before they've even been voiced as an inconvenience to be managed around, rather than a response to be genuinely considered. My parents arrived at the gate about 40 minutes after Brooke, E and I did, and I remember, now, a small detail that meant nothing to me at the time. My mother hugged me warmly, said something about how excited she was, and then excused herself almost immediately to go speak with the gate agent at the counter. A conversation, I assumed, if I thought about it at all, concerned some minor seating preference, the kind of small logistical check-in my mother occasionally liked to do herself, a habit I'd always found faintly endearing since it was so rarely necessary given how thoroughly I had already handled everything. I understand now that this was almost certainly the exact window in which the final piece of what she'd already set in motion earlier that day, over the phone, using my identity, was being confirmed and finalized at the gate itself. Boarding began. Group 1, then Group 2. My parents boarded early, using the priority status attached to the reservation I controlled. Brooke boarded a few minutes later, visibly uncomfortable, not making eye contact with me as she walked down the jet bridge, which I understand now was less coldness and more her own unresolved guilt about having known and stayed quiet. I remember watching her walk away and feeling, faintly, a small unease I couldn't name. The kind of unease you sometimes feel just before something happens, without any concrete evidence yet that anything is actually wrong. I stayed seated, waiting for my group to be called, scrolling idly through my phone, half watching the gate monitor cycle through boarding groups, and when I finally walked up to the counter and scanned my pass, it came back with a red screen and an error tone, sharp and unmistakable in the quiet of the mostly empty gate area. And Priya, apologetic and clearly confused herself, pulled up the reservation. On her screen, frowned at it for a long moment, and told me the system showed my seat had been released and reassigned less than an hour earlier, and that the flight was now fully boarded in my place. I remember the specific, disorienting quality of that moment, standing at a counter being told, essentially, that I did not currently exist within a system I had personally built. I asked Priya to check again. She did. The result was the same. I asked whether there had been some kind of system error, genuinely. At that point, still assuming some kind of technical glitch rather than anything deliberate, because a technical glitch was, frankly, the only explanation that made any sense to me in that first minute, given that I knew, with complete certainty, that I had booked and confirmed my own seat on this reservation myself. That is when my phone buzzed. Have fun walking home, loser. Then, 30 seconds later, take the BS, know your place. I want to describe what I felt reading those texts, because I think it's important to be honest about it rather than skip straight to the resolution. It was not, in the first several seconds, anger. It was something closer to a very specific, very old kind of hurt. The hurt of finally seeing, in plain, unambiguous text on a screen, something I had suspected about my place in my family for years but had never had confirmed quite this directly. Loser. Know your place. Those are not words you use casually towards someone you value. Those are words that come from somewhere real, somewhere that had clearly been sitting underneath the surface of my family for a long time, waiting for a moment low stakes enough, from my parents' perspective, to finally say out loud. I want to be honest about something else, too, standing at that counter. Part of what made those specific words land so hard was that they were, strangely and painfully, the first time either of my parents had ever spoken to me as though my feelings didn't matter at all, rather than simply behaving as though my feelings mattered slightly less than my usefulness. There is a real difference between those two things, and I had spent 37 years absorbing the second one without ever fully naming it, and standing there, reading Loser and Know Your Place on a screen, I understood, with total clarity for the first time, exactly how far that unnamed pattern could travel if it was ever allowed to escalate without resistance. I did not cry at the gate, though I want to be honest that I came close enough that I remember consciously counting my breaths, a technique I'd picked up somewhere years earlier for exactly this kind of moment. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. I did not call my mother screaming, though I understand why some people in this situation would have. What I did was ask Priya, calmly, whether she had a moment, and then I made the call. I want to explain exactly what that call was, because I think the mechanics matter, and because I think this is the part of the story that actually explains the ending, rather than the ending simply being a satisfying twist without an underlying logic. I did not call the police. I did not call a lawyer. Not yet. I called the airline's corporate travel desk, a dedicated line I have access to through my professional role in travel operations, a line most leisure travelers never even know exists, staffed by representatives trained to handle exactly the kind of complex account and authorization issues that ordinary customer service lines are not equipped for. I explained to a representative who happened to know me by name from prior business dealings, a woman named Marguerite, whose voice I recognized instantly from several previous professional interactions, that I was the primary account holder and paying passenger of record on a reservation from which I had just been removed without my knowledge or consent by a companion traveler who had no actual authority on the account. I want to be precise about why this mattered so much, structurally. Because I had booked the entire itinerary under my own frequent flyer account. As the primary traveler, my parents and Brooke were technically companions on a reservation I owned, not independent ticket holders in their own right. Airlines have specific rules, which most ordinary travelers never think about because they never need to, about who has the authority to modify a shared reservation like this. Marguerite pulled up the full record while I stood there, the line quiet for what felt like a very long 30 seconds while she reviewed it. She said, "Dana, I'm seeing an authorization on your account from earlier this afternoon. A caller who provided your name and enough verifying information to pass our standard identity check, requesting your seat be released and a new passenger added in its place." I said, "I did not make that call." She said, "I understand, and I want you to know that what you're describing meets our internal definition of unauthorized account access. Can you tell me who might have had access to enough of your personal information to pass verification as you?" I stood there, at the gate, and told her, honestly, that my mother almost certainly did. Because I had, over years of managing family logistics, at various points shared my date of birth, my frequent flyer number, and other identifying details with her in the ordinary course of coordinating trips on her behalf, information she had apparently retained and used that afternoon to call the airline, claimed to be me, and authorized the exact change that had just removed me from a trip I had planned and paid for. I felt something very specific settle into place when Marguerite confirmed what had actually happened. It was not just that I had been excluded from a trip I paid for. It was that my mother had gone further than exclusion. She had impersonated me to a corporation, using information she had access to specifically because I was the family's designated logistics person to remove me from something I owned. There is a particular cold clarity that arrives in a moment like that. A clarity that strips away every softer interpretation you might otherwise reach for, every version of the story where this was simply a miscommunication or an oversight, and leaves you looking directly at the actual, deliberate shape of what was done. Marguerite, whose name I want to mention again because I think she deserves real credit for how she handled this, was, I want to say clearly, appropriately alarmed on my behalf. She told me that, as the actual account holder, I had full authority to reverse the change immediately and, separately, to determine what happened with the reservation going forward, including whether the other travelers on it retained their seats at all. She said, "Dana, I want you to take whatever time you need to decide what you want to do here. This is your reservation. You get to decide what happens to it, not the person who tried to take it from you." I sat with that authority for a moment, at the gate, with Priya standing nearby, waiting patiently, giving me a kind of quiet, respectful space I was grateful for. And I want to be honest about the several different directions I considered in that moment. I could have simply had my own seat reinstated, removing Denise, and boarded the flight as originally planned, arriving in Cabo to a confrontation that would have played out over the following week in front of Denise and Brooke both, a version of events that felt, in that moment, exhausting to even imagine. I could have canceled the entire reservation outright, stranding my parents, Brooke, and Denise all at the departure gate together, which felt, in the heat of the moment, like the most direct answer to what had just been done to me. A version of poetic justice I will admit tempted me, genuinely, for longer than I am entirely proud of. I did neither of those things. In the end, though I want to be honest that I seriously considered the second option for at least a full minute before deciding against it, standing there running through, almost clinically, what each choice would actually accomplish, and what each choice would actually cost, not just to my parents, but to Brooke, who I did not believe deserved to be punished for a decision she had only learned about and never made. And to whatever version of my own character I wanted to walk away from this moment still recognizing. What I actually did was ask Marguerite to reverse the unauthorized change, reinstating my original seat, and to remove Denise from the reservation entirely, since she had never had a legitimate seat on my booking in the first place, her presence having only ever existed because of the fraudulent change my mother made. I did not cancel my parents' or Brooke's seats. I let them keep their tickets on the trip I had already paid for, because whatever my mother had done, I did not want to be the reason Brooke, who I believe was genuinely uncomfortable with the whole situation, or even my father, who I suspect knew less about the specific mechanics of what my mother had done than his supportive text suggested, lost a trip that, whatever its origins, was still meant to celebrate something real. What I did do, and this is the part that Priya relayed over her radio as there's been a change, was have my own seat reinstated in 2C, directly beside my parents, and have Denise's boarding pass, which had already been issued using my reassigned seat, deactivated at the gate, since her presence on the flight was never legitimately authorized to begin with. I want to describe walking down that jet bridge, because I think about it often. Priya walked with me partway, farther than she strictly needed to, and I remember her saying, quietly, just before I stepped onto the aircraft, "I don't usually say this, but good for you," a small, unofficial kindness from a stranger that meant more to me in that moment than I expected it to. I walked to row 2 and found my parents sitting there, my mother in the aisle seat beside where I would now be sitting. Her face, when she saw me standing in the aisle with my boarding pass in hand, going through a sequence of expressions I have turned over many times since. Confusion first, because as far as she knew, the trip continued exactly as she'd arranged it. Then a specific, dawning alarm, as she began to understand that if I was standing there, boarding pass in hand, something had gone differently than she'd planned. My father, in the window seat, looked up from his book with an expression that took a moment longer to shift, still catching up to what my mother was already beginning to process. I sat down in 2C. I did not say anything immediately. I fastened my seatbelt methodically, the same way I do everything, and looked straight ahead at the seat back in front of me for a long moment before either of us spoke. My mother, finally, said, quietly, so only I could hear over the ambient noise of other passengers still boarding, "Dana, what happened?" I said, "You impersonated me to the airline to have my seat given to Denise. That's what happened." Her face went, genuinely, pale, in a way I don't think I had ever seen from her before, because I don't think it had occurred to her, calling the airline that afternoon, that what she was doing constituted anything more serious than a family logistics adjustment, the kind she had watched me handle 100 times before without incident. I don't think she understood, until that exact moment in row 2, that using my identity without my knowledge to make a change on an account was not the same category of action as simply asking me to make a change myself, and that the airline, unlike me, was not going to quietly absorb it the way I had quietly absorbed so many other things over the years. Denise, I later learned from Brooke, had been standing at the gate when her boarding pass was deactivated and had ultimately taken a later flight home rather than continuing to Cabo alone. A resolution I feel genuinely uncomplicated about, since she had never had a legitimate claim to that seat in the first place, whatever her own understanding of the situation might have been at the time. I have no ill will toward Denise specifically. I understand she was likely told, by my mother, some version of events that made her presence on that trip feel entirely appropriate, and I don't believe she bears meaningful responsibility for a decision that was never hers to make. I want to tell you about the flight itself, because it was, unsurprisingly, one of the more excruciating 5 hours of my adult life. My mother tried, several times, to explain herself in a low voice, careful not to be overheard by nearby passengers. She said things like, "I just thought it would be easier," and "I didn't think you'd actually mind that much once you were there," and at one point, closer to something real, "I think I've just always assumed you'd go along with things, because you always have." I did not respond much during the flight. I want to be honest that I was not entirely ready, in that moment, to have the full conversation the situation deserved, sitting 3 feet from her in a pressurized cabin with nowhere for either of us to go, and I told her that, plainly, somewhere over the middle of the flight. I said, "Mom, I hear you, but I am not going to have this conversation right now, in these seats, with nowhere for either of us to actually process it. We are going to talk about this, just not here." My father, for most of the flight, said very little at all, which was, I have come to understand, entirely characteristic of him in moments of real conflict. A tendency to go quiet and let my mother's version of events carry the room. A pattern I would eventually need to address with him separately and directly. I want to tell you about landing and the first few days of the trip because I think the slow, uncomfortable thaw of those days matters to the full shape of this story. We arrived at the resort in near silence, checked into the room, which was, notably, still configured for exactly 4, and spent that first evening in a strange, careful politeness. Everyone speaking a little too formally, avoiding the subject entirely, going through the motions of an anniversary dinner my mother and father had, at least, genuinely been looking forward to in a way that felt watching. Them, both understandable and, given everything, difficult to fully begrudge them. Brooke found me alone on the second morning, sitting by the pool before the others were awake, and sat down beside me without asking. She said, "Dana, I need to tell you that I knew, before the airport, and I didn't say anything, and I have felt sick about it every single day since." I asked her why she hadn't told me. She said, "Mom asked me not to, and I told myself that not telling you was different from lying to you, which I know now isn't really true. I was scared of being the one who blew it up before it happened, and I let that fear be bigger than doing the right thing. And I am so sorry, Dana, because you deserve to know, and I had every chance to tell you, and I didn't take it." I told Brooke, honestly, that I appreciated her saying that, and that I believed her, and that I also needed her to understand something about the larger pattern this fit into, one that predated this specific trip by decades. I said, "Brooke, I don't think this is only about you keeping one secret for a few days. I think it's about a much longer pattern where I've been the one who handles things, and you've been the one who gets protected from having to handle them, including, apparently, being protected from having to tell me an uncomfortable truth. I'm not saying that to punish you. I'm saying it because I think we both need to look at it clearly if anything between us is actually going to change." She cried, a little, and said she understood and that she wanted to be better about it going forward. And I believe, in the months since, that she genuinely has been. I want to tell you about the conversation we eventually did have. My mother and I, 4 days into the trip, sitting on the patio of the resort room I had also, notably, paid for, once the initial shock had worn off enough for both of us to speak more honestly than we had on the plane. I said, "Mom, I need you to understand something clearly, and I need you to actually hear it rather than just waiting for me to finish so you can explain again. What happened at that airport wasn't a scheduling inconvenience. You used my personal information to impersonate me to a corporation, to remove me from something I had planned and paid for as a gift to you, and then you and Dad mocked me by text while I was standing at the gate finding out about it. I need you to sit with the actual size of that, not the smaller version of it that's easier to feel bad about." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I think I have spent so many years thinking of you as the daughter who handles things, who doesn't need the same consideration Brooke needs, because you've never seemed to need it, that I stopped actually seeing you as someone with feelings that could be hurt by something like this." I told myself, when Denise asked, that you'd understand, because you always understand. I think I used your own competence as an excuse not to have to consider your feelings at all. I told her that was, unfortunately, the most honest thing she had said to me in years, and that I needed her to understand that being capable and being willing to be treated poorly are not the same thing, no matter how long she had been allowed to treat them as though they were. I said, "Mom, every single time I have handled something for this family, the funeral, the flights, Grandma's estate, I did it because I wanted to help, and because I loved you all, and somewhere along the way, that turned into an assumption that I existed to be used without anyone ever checking whether I still wanted to be. I need that to stop. Not because I want to stop helping, because I want to be asked, and I want my answer to actually matter, the way Brooke's answer has always mattered." My mother asked, quietly, what would it look like for things to actually change? I told her I didn't fully know yet, but that it would need to start with her genuinely believing that my feelings carried the same weight as Brooke's. Not just saying it, but actually adjusting the countless small decisions that had, for decades, assumed otherwise. My father, separately, found me the following afternoon, apologized for the text message, which he described somewhat weakly, as him simply agreeing with what my mother had already said rather than something he'd have originated himself. An explanation I did not find especially satisfying, and told him so directly. I said, "Dad, agreeing with something cruel and sending it anyway makes you responsible for it too. You don't get to be the passive one in this." He said, "You're right. I've spent our whole marriage letting your mother be the one who decides things, and it's easier. And I think somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing when what she decided was actually wrong." I said, "I need you to start noticing." He said he would try. I told him trying was a start, but that I would be watching for more than trying going forward. I want to talk to you directly now, wherever you are, whatever time it is. My family had spent decades quietly organizing itself around a specific, unspoken arrangement in which my competence was treated as a substitute for my feelings mattering, rather than something separate from them entirely. That arrangement worked smoothly for a very long time, specifically because I kept absorbing it without naming it. It stopped working the moment my mother mistook my competence for something she could use against me, impersonating the very account access that competence had built, and mocking me for the inconvenience of my own erasure. If you are the capable one in your family, the one things get handed to because you'll handle it well, please understand that your competence is not an invitation for the people around you to assume your feelings are less important than everyone else's. Being good at solving problems does not mean you exist to absorb whatever gets done to you along the way. And if you ever find yourself standing at a gate or anywhere else, discovering that the people who are supposed to love you have decided your role is simply to accommodate whatever they've arranged around you, know that you are allowed to make the call, whatever that call looks like for you. I think often about the specific mechanism that let this go on for so long, because I don't think my parents are cruel people, not fundamentally. And I don't want this story to sound like a simple condemnation of them without any attempt to understand where it actually came from. I think what happened at that gate was the endpoint of 37 years of a small, repeated miscalculation made by them and, if I'm honest, reinforced by me, in which my willingness to help was quietly recoded year after year from a generous choice into an assumed obligation, until neither side fully remembered it had ever been a choice at all. Brooke and I have talked, since, at real length, about the role each of us was assigned growing up. Hers to be effortlessly loved, mine to be quietly useful, and neither of us, we've agreed, ever actually chose the role we ended up performing. We are trying, slowly, to build something more honest between the four of us, my parents included. Though I want to be clear that trying is not the same as having arrived anywhere yet. My mother has not called the airline on my behalf again. I have not offered to book another family trip since. Some things, I've found, take longer to rebuild than a phone call can fix. I want to describe one more moment from that trip, because I think it belongs in this story even though it doesn't resolve anything neatly. On the actual anniversary evening, the sunset dinner cruise I had booked months earlier, before any of this happened, went forward as planned. I remember standing at the railing of that boat, watching the sun go down over the water, my parents a few feet away, my father's arm around my mother's shoulders, the two of them looking, from a distance, exactly like the couple in the photograph I'd used to plan the whole trip in the first place. I felt, watching them, a genuinely complicated thing, a real tenderness toward the marriage itself, toward whatever had kept the two of them together and generally happy for 40 years, sitting right alongside a very clear-eyed awareness that this same marriage had, apparently, also produced a household in which impersonating your own daughter to an airline felt, in the moment, like a reasonable solution to a minor social awkwardness. Both of those things were true on that boat at the same time, and I have stopped trying to resolve them into a single, simpler feeling because I don't think they're actually in conflict. I think that's just what a long, real, imperfect family looks like, up close, once you finally stop editing out the parts that don't fit the story you'd rather be telling about it. I also want to tell you what happened when we got home, because the story doesn't end at the resort, and I think the return is honestly the part that mattered most in the long run. The first few weeks back were quiet, in the specific, careful way that follows a real rupture. Everyone slightly more polite than usual, slightly more deliberate about what got said out loud. My mother called me about 3 weeks after we landed and asked if she could come over, alone, without my father, to talk further. I said yes. She sat at my kitchen table, the same kind of table where I'd once built a household budget for her at 16, and she said, "Dana, I've been thinking about something you said in Cabo, that I used your competence as an excuse not to consider your feelings. I want to tell you I've been sitting with that every day since, and I keep landing on the same uncomfortable thing, which is that I think I did the same thing to my own mother, your grandmother, when she was alive. She was the capable one in her family too, and I watched my aunts lean on her for decades the way I've leaned on you. And I told myself I would never do that to my own children. And then I did it anyway, so thoroughly that I didn't even notice until it blew up at an airport gate. I did not have an immediate response to that, and I told her so, honestly. I said, "Mom, I appreciate you telling me that, and I don't think I'm ready to fully forgive what happened yet, and I don't think you should expect me to be. I think what I need, more than an apology right now, is time to see whether anything actually changes in how you treat me, day to day, in the small, ordinary moments, not just in the big, dramatic ones." She said she understood, and that she was prepared to be patient while I figured out what rebuilding trust with her would actually require. I want to be honest with you that 4 months out from that night at the gate, I am still, in many ways, in the middle of figuring that out myself. There are days when I feel genuinely closer to my mother than I have in years, because this whole situation forced a level of honesty between us that decades of smooth, easy competence never once required. And there are other days, particularly when some small new instance of the old pattern surfaces. My mother asking Brooke to handle something instead of asking me directly, a habit she's trying to build, or my father staying quiet in a moment where I need him to speak up, when I feel the whole thing rushing back, sharp and immediate, as though I'm standing at that gate counter again, watching my boarding. Pass, fail to scan. I think that's simply what repair actually looks like in a real family, rather than the tidy version of repair you sometimes see in stories like this one. Not a single dramatic conversation that fixes everything permanently, but a long, uneven, ongoing process. 2 steps of genuine progress, followed by 1 step of an old habit resurfacing, followed by another conversation, another adjustment, another small test of whether the change is actually holding. I don't know yet exactly where my family and I will land longer term. What I do know is that I am no longer willing to find out by simply absorbing whatever comes my way and calling it love, the way I did for 37 years, right up until the moment I was standing at a gate at 11 o'clock at night, reading the words "Know Your Place" on a screen, and finally understanding with total clarity that the place I had been assigned was never actually one I had agreed to occupy. That is today's story on the Family Ledger. Leave a comment wherever you are watching from. Tell me what time it is. Tell me whether you've ever been the capable one in your family and what it cost you. I read every single one. Subscribe for the next story every week. Check the description for another one I think you will connect with. Thank you for being here.